So the title of this presentation, as you can see, is Booker T. Washington and Sammy Young Jr., the Black Radical Tradition at Tuskegee. We know that in the 1960s, black students all over the United States had a massive and powerful movement. That's not news. Certainly not to anybody here. What is news, rather especially to scholarly literature, is that there was such a movement at Tuskegee, and no one yet, to my knowledge, has studied or examined the way that this played out at Tuskegee. And yet Tuskegee is a very important place, we're talking about place here, to look at in terms of black educational paradigms and development over time. So part of what I want to discuss here is the way in which a politicized student group ended up challenging and revising what I might call the political educational paradigm of Tuskegee and trying to transform it. And of course, Tuskegee, the legacy of it is in many ways overdetermined by the words and philosophy and strategies of its founder, Booker T. Washington, who established Tuskegee in 1881. Normally we think of Du Bois as his kind of counterpoint or interlocutor, and what I want to basically argue here is that rather than going to Harvard in the North to find a debate or disagreement over what Tuskegee could be, we have only to look to the students themselves at the school from its very beginning. Letters, petitions, strikes, protests, all the way up, starting in the 19th century and all the way up through the period that I'm describing and beyond. And just to say a bit, there is a substantial debate about how to characterize Booker T. Washington's political educational paradigm. A generous interpretation would be that he advocated for putting aside political and civil agitation in favor of pursuing economic and educational opportunities. A more critical interpretation would be, following James Anderson and others, that he participated in or collaborated in a paradigm that was about socializing black folk for a subordinated position in the post-war U.S. South. And certainly we know that whatever he said publicly, privately he was very active in politics, and he built a political empire and political machine that had influence all the way up to the White House and even beyond. And there's new work out by Andrew Zimmerman and others that explore his transnational reach and unfortunately some of his collaborations with colonialism. But anyway, putting that aside for the moment, let's look at what the students had to say. And in particular, I'm going to talk about the life and untimely death of this Tuskegee student, Sammy Young Jr., pictured here. As you can see, very light-skinned. In fact, he had blue eyes, often passed for white, and he and his darker-skinned friends, he grew up in the town of Tuskegee, he could date his family back to a time before Booker T. Washington ever showed up in the place. So he's from an old Tuskegee family. And he is worth looking at not only because of the death that I'm going to describe and show you part of, but also because of his activism in his life and who he was. He is emblematic of Tuskegee activists in this time. That is to say, he was upper middle class. He was a young man of means. He's in his Navy uniform because he took some time off to go to the Navy and then come back to Tuskegee, but he spent his high school years at a boarding school in New England. He had a private automobile. When my father arrived in Tuskegee in 1957, he'd never seen anything like it. He'd never seen black people with swimming pools in their backyards. My father's from Inkster, Michigan. Many people I interviewed more than a dozen former Tuskegee students, all describe mid-century Tuskegee as a kind of black middle-class utopia. Basically a place where there was like no crime, people went on vacation, left their door unlocked for a month. It was like they were living well. You had possibly the greatest concentration of black folk with advanced degrees anywhere in the United States at that moment, more than 2,000. And that I'm talking about not just the university, but also there's a veterans hospital on the campus grounds. And I think it's important to note this is not the fulfillment of Washington's dream, as some have argued, which was really an anachronistic, even at the moment of his death, a kind of agricultural dream of small business and landowning. These were quite the opposite. These were academics. These were people with advanced degrees who were spitting knowledge, and their salaries were paid for by philanthropy. And then on the other hand, you had the federal payroll at the veterans hospitals paid for by the federal government. So this is not Booker T. Washington's dream, but it is a dream, and it's a middle-class dream that's thriving at mid-century in Tuskegee. And I just want to say one other thing, which is that whatever you might say about the pretensions, the black bourgeoisie, what have you, There were some really caring educators in this place. A theme of my interviews is like these educators would bend over backwards, especially for the poorer students. They would find some way for them to finish, some way for them to stay in school, some way for them to work on their tuition. If they failed a class, they would have a chance to take it again. The professors would meet with them outside of class. This is a very caring community where everybody was supported and they tried to lift people up. But this was a middle class community, and the students were cut from this cloth. Seated there is Gwen Paton, who, if you read, flip through the index of pretty much any book about the civil rights movement, and she's mentioned and interviewed. She was a force in the civil rights movement, although never has been studied herself. She has an archive in Montgomery. There's no scholarly research about her, but she is in almost all scholarly research about the civil rights movement. She later goes on to have a whole career in Black Power formations nationally. She's, you could give many talks just about her. But the point is that she and the other activists, as they're getting started in the civil rights movement, are still in an educational paradigm that's about their personal and individual advancement. It's not uncommon in these years for Fortune 500 companies to chase down Tuskegee students and try to snatch them off campus, like IBM, Xerox. All of the kind of military industrial people are really after these students, and they have a ladder upwards. This is a ladder paradigm of education, uplift through your individual achievement. You are going to become part of the new, and this is definitely not the model of socializing you for subordination in the South. This is the industrializing South, and we are socializing you to take the highest rungs. We're socializing you, we're preparing you to take your place in management in the new, modernizing, industrializing South. But there's something else going on, which is that Tuskegee, this island of wealth, this place exists in a sea of poverty. It is smack in the middle of the Black Belt, where people still live as they did nearly 50, 60, 70 years earlier. Unlike some of the counterparts at other historically Black colleges and universities, to their credit, the Tuskegee administrators pushed students out into the Black Belt counties to work as tutors. And so many of these students, for the first time, saw real poverty. For the first time, saw people living with dirt floors, windowless shacks, that sort of thing. And it had a radicalizing effect. But also, this is a time when people in the Black Belt counties are not just suffering, they're not just victims, they're aroused. They're indignant. They're organizing. Here we see the offices of an initiative by the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, where they're developing an independent political party to contest for power, electoral power, in Lowndes County, which is near to Macon County, where Tuskegee is. And they take as their symbol the Black Panther. Walking away with his sunglasses perched in his afro is Michael Wright, who later will go on to be a leading Tuskegee activist in the late 1960s. But the point is that these students came into contact with SNCC. So Tuskegee student activists knew Stokely Carmichael and James Foreman, and they were all collaborating. And even Carmichael and Sammy Young began a discussion about, could we develop an independent political party in Macon County? As well. Sammy Young goes back to Tuskegee and is involved in all kinds of activism, primarily aimed at desegregation. We're going to desegregate the swimming pools. We're going to desegregate the churches. Never went to church in his life, but suddenly he wants to desegregate the churches. But the point is that to expose the hypocrisy of this place that's advertising itself as a model city where black and white get along and always have. And so the student activists are not having it in there. This is Sammy Young standing in the middle, very dapper in his suit, trying to desegregate the church. Coming home one night from a SNCC meeting just outside of town, he gets into a conflict with a 67-year-old white gas station attendant over which restroom, whites only or the official one or the one in the... He gets into a conflict over which restroom he, blue-eyed, pale-skinned Sammy Young is allowed to use. And they go at it, and it's a long back and forth, but the point is that the gas station attendant shoots him in the head and kills him. Sammy Young's murder has many, many ripples, not only in Tuskegee, but in the wider Black student movement and in the Black Power movement and beyond, that I don't have time to go through, but I'm going to give you a flavor of some of the ripples that I think are worth us understanding and appreciating Tuskegee and Sammy's role in the Black Power moment. In the first place, there was a massive reaction on campus. That is, that students protested in downtown for weeks uninterrupted, every day, sitting in, locking up the downtown business area, demanding that the things Sammy had fought for be accomplished immediately. The woman standing speaking here is wearing a TIAL t-shirt. TIAL stands for Tuskegee Institute Advancement League. And the slogan underneath is Freedom Now. It's not yet Black Power, but it's headed in that direction. Here's another ripple of Sammy Young. 2 days after he's murdered, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee issues a statement against the Vietnam War, the first civil rights organization to stick its neck out. 2 days after Sammy is murdered is SNCC. They've been working on this statement for months, but they finally release it, motivated by the death of a Navy veteran and a black college student fighting for civil rights. It's a remarkable statement, but here's an excerpt where they compare Sammy Young to the Vietnamese and say that both are fighting for their liberation and against the same enemy, the United States government. That's not peace now. That's not an end to the fighting. We're with the enemy. We're with the enemy. This is a treasonous statement. And another ripple that I don't have time to talk about is the fact that young SNCC member Julian Bond, who helped craft the statement, was denied his congressional seat because of his role in making this statement. So this is about the way that Sammy Young's activism and death are beginning to flip the script on a whole series of relationships at Tuskegee that include colonialism, as I mentioned earlier. Fortunately for me as a historian, a Tuskegee student photographed his bookshelf in the late 1960s. By the way, this is a photo by Chester Higgins Jr., who goes on to become if you Google him, he's a world-famous photographer. But trying out his camera, he took a picture of his bookshelf, and it confirms what interviews and other people, and what we generally know about the Black student movement. That is, they're interested in issues of the Black diaspora, in cultural connections. They're reading Leroy Jones, blues people, but they're also interested in the decolonization movement, in national liberation, in the political struggles that are shaking the so-called Third World and especially the African continent. They're reading Jomo Kenyatta. They're reading Frantz Fanon. And just a side note, which is that they have something in common with Jomo Kenyatta and Frantz Fanon and Ho Chi Minh and Che Guevara, which is they're kind of cut from the same social cloth. There's this class of university-educated people stuck in kind of backward, anachronistic social relations who rebel against those relations and try to forge new national identities and they imagine liberatory ones in that moment. So they actually begin to, not just because of this kind of personal social connection, but they begin to look for political reasons to what's going on in the Third World, and especially in Africa, as a political guide for what they might do in Tuskegee. That is, instead of just desegregate Tuskegee, the town, that they might decolonize it. Now, at the time when people are appropriating the Black Panther symbol and taking it to the Bay Area and trying to police the police as like a kind of Black Power moment, the first impulse at Tuskegee is to become the police. Tuskegee student Lucius Amerson, centered here, runs for office, decides because of the murder of Sammy Young Jr. that he could run for office and win, and convinces the students to back him. Interestingly, the faculty and administration oppose him. They back a white guy for sheriff of Macon County because they think it's too much too fast. But the students back Lucius Amerson, and the students prevail. And in November of '66, he's elected the first Black sheriff in the South since Reconstruction, which is a political earthquake that explodes. I mean, they make a Hollywood film based on his life. It's national and arguably even international news. The New York Magazine says that there's a big chunk of Alabama soil that is no longer the political province of the white man. An overstatement, but people are excited that suddenly the weapons are in the hands of a Black man in the middle of the Black Belt. And there's many imitators who try to do the same thing in other places. And that's why, and some of this gets codified and registered in the Black Power literature, and we forget this. We don't associate Tuskegee with like the Black Power moment, but first of all, two people who were intimately acquainted with Sammy Young and with his work write books about it. James Forman wrote a book about Sammy Young Jr. called Sammy Young Jr., the first Black college student to die in the Black Liberation Movement. And Stokely Carmichael, who's now Kwame Ture, and by the way, former Tuskegee professor Charles Hamilton, when they team up to try to spell out the way they define Black Power, they devote an entire chapter to the prospect of turning Tuskegee into a model of Black Power, building on the anger that's aroused from the death of Sammy Young and the election of Lucius Amerson. Well, needless to say, Marvin Seagrass' trial is moved to an all-white county nearby, and he is swiftly acquitted. at the end of 1966, and according to Campus Digest, students riot. But in addition to rioting, they turn their attention away from, or begin to turn their attention away from their previous goals of, or their kind of gaze, which is at what's wrong with the banks downtown and the department stores and the swimming pools and the churches and who holds electoral office. And they start to say, wait a minute, why did the administration oppose the election of Lucius Amerson? What kind of school do we go to? In other words, they turn their attention around to their school and start asking hard questions about Tuskegee itself. And they indict Tuskegee in ways that are quite remarkable. They begin to use blackness and whiteness in a political sense. And they indict Tuskegee as white. Here's a poem by Arthur Pfister. Tuskegee is mean, so big and mighty, but it still makes black people into copies of Whitey. Ain't that sad? And the way it's making them, as you can see in the pictures, the way it makes copies of Whitey is through the military training. The proud military history of Tuskegee is now flipped and is suddenly a point of shame and dishonor that black people are participating in the military. And we know that Charles Hamilton is one of the, if you read like Martha Biondi or Ibram Rogers, he's now Ibram Kendi, if you read their stuff on the black student movement, you know that Charles Hamilton is one of the first authors of the black university concept that sweeps through historically black universities, colleges and universities at this time. But actually it's a Tuskegee student who is the first student to articulate the black university concept. It's a Tuskegee graduate student, Ernest Stevens, who lays out here an idea, an alternate conception of what his HBCUs could be. And he argues that it's not the professors, it's not the administrators, it's not certainly not the trustees who are going to push through any of these changes that are urgently needed. It's us, the students, are the ones who are going to have to do it. And it has to do not only with teaching black studies and that sort of thing, but with a whole new paradigm that's not just about climbing a kind of corporate ladder, but it's about collective social change. It's about critique and change and arming us collectively to do something different in the world than just fit ourselves into the world as it is. So this is yet another revision of the prevailing paradigm at Tuskegee. And in '68, just 4 days after Dr. King is assassinated, the students take over the main administrative building at Tuskegee, hold the Board of Trustees hostage, including a major general. One student joked with me that he was the first person to capture a Southern major general since the Civil War. But anyway, they present them, in their face, they present them with their demands. And it's just a kind of remarkable political moment. By the way, these are just a few of the amazing photos that we have in the archives from here. And so I guess what I want to say here is that this history, which first of all is not circulating as part of how we think of the development of civil rights. So part of what I'm just doing here is like recovery of like, hey, by the way, Tuskegee played a major role in the way all of these things shook out. But it's also that in terms of educational paradigms for black people, there is something about the Booker T. Washington paradigm that I believe is recurring and is part of recurring tensions in black education over what is it for, what are we doing, what does it imply about our status or not, social change, individual change, and these sorts of things. One of the things that's most surprising in my research is the way in which students process the dissonance, in my view, what is dissonance between what they were doing and the legacy of Booker T. Washington. Some students at the time and now, some defend Booker T. Washington and say, basically, he was one of us. Like, because he created an all-black university long ago, he got it. And here Gwen Paton says he was trying to develop black militants. That's what he was about all along. And there's a pattern of people, like Marcus Garvey. There's other people who interpret Washington this way, who read this into Washington. But it was also remarkable in my interviews that every single person I interviewed, unsolicited, said back to me, paraphrased back to me, that it was very common to hear the words of Ralph Ellison's narrator from Invisible Man, who's on a kind of thinly veiled copy of Tuskegee's campus, gazing up at the statue of the founder, lifting the veil of ignorance of a slave. And in the mid-1960s, it was common to hear students flipping the script and saying, well, is he lifting the veil or is he lowering it more firmly in place? Thank you.